Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Side Hustles and Startups, the podcast where we talk to business owners all around the world and get their insider tips just for you. So, hi everyone, and welcome to another one of our Side Hustle and Startups podcasts. My guest today is John, who I'm delighted to have with us. And what we're going to do now is find out all about John, find about what he does in the startup and business world. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with John over the next 45, 50 minutes, and we can find about everything that goes on in his world. So John, welcome, and thank you for joining us on our podcast.
No, thank you. This is for me is a delight and a pleasure. I'm happy to be here, and yes, if you want my life story, you're more than welcome to it. It's a rather long one, I'm afraid.
Don't worry, we've got plenty of time.
That's all right. Plenty of time. That's all right.
Right, so would you start off then? Because just before we actually went live with this, you started to touch on telling me about your social enterprise. And I very kindly asked you if you would just wait so that we could kind of have it almost real time. So everyone who's listening, I'm going to be hearing it at the same time as them. So would you mind telling me what your social enterprise is, what it does, and how it got started?
Yeah. My social enterprise centres and focuses on loneliness, particularly in old people, but it could be in anybody really. We all suffer it, and not many people would admit to it. How did it begin? Well, I believe in fate really, and in this life things have happened to me that they happen to everybody, I suppose, but they just happen because they happen. I went to a networking meeting locally. I live in Kidderminster in Worcestershire, and I went to a local networking meeting. I met a guy that once I'd spoken to him for a while, I realised he was a bank manager of mine from years back, a fellow called Andy Mullaney. And Andy was absolutely magic, and he suggested to me that I might like to consider forming a social enterprise. And I didn't know what a social enterprise was. So he said, well, you need to go and talk to my accountant. So off I went and spoke to his accountant and thought, that's a good idea, we could do that. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to do. Bear in mind, this is 2016 I'm talking about, and so I was 2 years off my 70th birthday. So I would say to anybody watching this podcast, that's the first lesson. You're never too old, never, ever too old to start. So I went to apply for a scholarship at the School for Social Enterprise, and I won the scholarship. And during the course of the events, one of the ladies in the group suggested that I was a very good storyteller, and maybe the way to get to lonely people was to go into care homes and tell a story. And so we set a meeting up with a local care home in Birmingham, and off I went, and I told the story of my life and my mum's life. My mum was born in 1922 and lived through the war, lost her dad just before the war started. Had a very interesting story, interesting life, and it went down really well. But at the end of it, the lady in charge said, you know, what would be good? Could you put some music with it? I said, oh yes, I can do that. So I went back and I did the story of Vera Lynn, I think, and music of the age, of the 50s really. And the group was made up of half and half really, probably about 30 people, half of whom had got dementia and half hadn't. And it doesn't really matter in this situation whether they have or not. And at the time I had a mother-in-law suffering from dementia, so I was well used to dealing with that. And I enjoyed it as much as they did. We had great fun. And I was tweeting about it, as you do. And I got a tweet from the then governor of Leicester Prison, Phil Novis. Phil was a diamond. Phil was one of these prison governors who wants to do the best for his men. And so we went to Leicester Prison.
So can I ask a question then? So before you went to Leicester Prison, you'd been to meet these people in this home. Had you actually set the social enterprise up by that time?
Yes.
You had.
Yes.
Would you mind just sharing with everyone what a social enterprise is? Because there might be some people listening that they may have heard about business, they may have heard about limited companies and even sole traders. But some of our listeners and viewers might not know what a social enterprise is. So could you share that?
A social enterprise is a limited company with a heart.
Lovely.
That sums it up in a sentence. A social enterprise is not always understood by everybody. I went to the Lloyds Bank to open an account for my new social enterprise, and the lady behind the counter said, what's a social enterprise? You might know it better as a not-for-profit. So a social enterprise has to have a purpose for somebody other than shareholders. It doesn't really have shareholders. And so in my case, my social enterprise would charge for its services, and from the income derived would pay me a salary for doing it. However, the surplus, which in a limited company would go to the shareholders, is actually allows me to provide free services to other people. So if I've got, for example, a local authority care home that has got no budget for this kind of thing, but has a desperate need for it, then I can go and do it for free. And that's what I've been doing in prisons. That's really what we did. So I went across to Leicester Prison, and one Saturday morning was met by the officer at the door, and he said, we're working in the SEG today, John. I said, wonderful, what's the SEG? And his SEG turns out to be the segmented area of the prison, where the naughty boys that have been sent to prison, but then have committed another crime in prison. So I found myself in the SEG with about 24 prisoners and a couple of prison officers, and away we went. And I told the story of Elvis's life, Elvis Presley. Played Jailhouse Rock, which my wife said you shouldn't be doing that, at Star Riot. We did it anyway. It was like party time in the SEG, really. And when I came out of there, it was a wonderful feeling of success.
Yeah.
That the men had loved it and I'd loved it as well.
What kind of age were they? Because I imagine they all heard. Everyone's heard of Elvis, haven't they? But
yeah,
I suppose some of them might have heard of him, but they didn't really.
Yeah, I would say the average age was probably in their 50s. But they were all ages from 20, 30 onwards. Age is not really relevant. To those of you watching this podcast, if you think about loneliness as a separate entity, you can be lonely in a crowd. You can go to a football match, and if you're sitting there on your own and your team's losing, you're feeling lonely. If you're a student at university and it's your first week, freshers week, you've not made new friends yet, you can be lonely. Anybody can be lonely at any time. Very few of us like to admit it. I'm lonely sometimes. I sit in my little office at home wondering what I'm going to do with my social enterprise next, and I'm lonely because it's just me. So loneliness is not something to be worried about. It's something that you confront and do something about. And that's what I did. So having been in Leicester Prison, I was then told that we don't have the budget, John. And this is true today as it was then. You know, they've got no money. Would you charge for this service? Yes, I would, because I want to provide it to people on the outside for free. However, I got sent to Stafford Prison, here where we are today, just a stone's throw really from these studios.
That's right, yeah.
And met the governor, the wonderful Ralph Lobkowski, and Ralph was very much up for this. Give it a go, John, give it a try. Go into our senior support group area. So in we go to Stafford Prison, into the chapel. This time we had about 50 residents, perhaps half a dozen prison officers.
How's the event promoted? So what do they say is happening?
Within
is it
the prison?
John? Yeah. So is it John's coming in to talk about this, or are there posters going up? Is it word of mouth? What's the
posters are going up?
What's the message before you actually talk?
Before I go to the prison the first time, posters are going up.
Yeah.
Telling people what I'm going to do, and most people will be interested in it, mainly because it gets them out of their cell and into a public environment as much as it can be within a prison.
So is it saying a talk by John, or is it come and meet John? Is it how's it?
It'll be. Do you like Elvis Presley? Yes. Then come and listen to Elvis's music, and John will tell you the story of Elvis's life, which I've done many times now, and it's an interesting life. Of course, we all know how it ends, you know, with his tragic death and that part of it. So we had men dancing in the aisles, you know. So you've got an awful lot of people in prison with mental health problems. Depression, anxiety, that kind of thing. And the way out of it is either pills, which they give them in prison, or do something about it to clear their head a bit, to cheer them up, if you like. And that's what this does. This is primarily about mental health, and it's aimed at loneliness, and that cures the other depression, anxiety, etc. And that worked well, and from that followed a contract to go into the SSG, Senior Support Group, every week with a different story. And so I became well known to the men, and they were able to nominate which stories they liked. So they would tell me this week what they'd like to do next week, and then during that week I would research the story, record some music on my computer, and it would all go in next week, and I'd tell them the story. And it ranged through a whole lot of people that most youngsters nowadays would never have heard of. Lonnie Donegan, for example, a lot of people never have heard of him. Benny Hill, loads of stuff.
So you'd finish the session by saying, who would you like me to come and talk about next week?
Yes.
And then the people who are with you in that room, they'll start throwing out suggestions.
I give them control, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But and the other thing I do is I develop a relationship with these men because I get to know them. So the two things I never want to know, and I tell them from the start, never ever tell me why you're here. That's not where I'm at. And certainly don't tell me how long you're going to be here, because that would give a clue to the crime they've committed. And on that basis, we become friends.
It's like a neutral starting ground, isn't
Yes.
it? It's just how you move forward.
Yes, because, in all honesty, some of the crimes for which the people are in there for are horrible. You don't want to know. I don't want to know either. I certainly don't want to chat it through with somebody, So it goes from there. So went into Stafford, got the contract, did this for a while, and then somebody suggested to me that they'd quite like to do some poetry. And so I said, yeah, all right. So then they introduced me to this dynamic purchasing system that they've got in the prison. And as soon as I got registered on there, Stafford Prison put up a job that they wanted a man to come in and do poetry with their men.
Right.
And they wanted a 24-week contract. So we did 3 8-week sessions. And the day it started was the day the Queen died. And once again, I went in, introduced myself to a lot of the men I didn't know, some I did, and told them that the whole object of the exercise was to produce a book of poetry, and that they would be featured in the book, and their poems would be in print, and the books would be sold for profit, and the profit would go to the charity of their choice. And it was as simple as that. And what topic would you like to do? And it didn't take them long to decide on the Queen. So I had the broadest brushstroke of poems written, well over 100 poems, taking royalty as the theme rather than the Queen. So I had a lot of poems on the Queen herself, but also on the Duke of Edinburgh, also on the children, it's now King Charles, etc. I had Corky dogs, I had Land Rovers, I had Sandringham, I had Balmoral, anything royal, and we compiled a book.
So have you got background in poetry or writing, or how
No.
did you? So
In
that's
the word.
interesting. So, well, how did you do your research on how you were going to do the session? Because not only are you not a poet, I presume, before this,
Well,
maybe.
you presume wrongly, because we're all poets.
Okay.
We all do it without thinking.
Yeah.
And when you look at modern poetry, if you look at a professional poet and look at the way they form their poems, they are really written stories that trip off the tongue. So the school I went to many years ago taught you that a poem had to rhyme at the end of each line, and
That's right. Yeah.
not anymore.
I remember being taught that.
Not anymore. So the poetry I write started in prison because I would attend visits day. This is what prompted them to get into poetry. So picture me in the visits hall. There are probably about 25 men and all their associated visitors in the room together. There's a real hubbub going on. And I'm there assisting. I meet the men, I chat with them, I chat with their family, I generally befriend people, making a welcoming atmosphere in the room. And then I sit back and watch, and I found myself writing poetry based on my views. So the very first one I wrote, for example, was the Christmas visits. And before the visits door opened, I was chatting to one of the residents there, and he was telling me that his wife and his little girl were coming to see him. And it was sad because he was going to be in over Christmas. He wouldn't be there on Christmas morning, and his little girl was 2 years of age. And so I sat back when the doors opened, and the very first person to come in was this little 2-year-old girl, dressed, and I say it very respectably, like a Christmas tree. She had a beautiful red dress on for Daddy, rapidly followed by Mum, and the little girl ran across the floor, saw her dad, gave him the biggest hug, and then the wife came along and did the same, and there was a tear in my eye, and I wrote a poem about what I'd watched. I learned later that my mum had died the year before, and I remembered that I'd found some poetry that she'd written, and so I think it's probably in the genes a little bit.
Yeah.
What I decided to do, I would write a poem, one a week for every week of the year, and put it out on Facebook and see what people liked and didn't like. And so I covered very many topics, not just the nice ones, the horrible ones. Again, your viewers might know of what we currently term IPP prisoners. So this is a thing that's going on as we talk. The IPP sentence was a sentence introduced in the early 2000s, and it was designed to allow judges to make a decision. So the crime that's been committed might be the simplest of crimes, shoplifting or minor theft or whatever, and it would normally carry a prison sentence of up to 2 years. But if the judge felt at that time that the man actually, I say man because mostly it's men doing it, if the man would be a threat to public protection, perhaps he carried a knife when he carried out his crime or something like that, they would give him an IPP sentence, which means he serves the 2 years, but then he can't come out after that until he proves to the prison that he's not going to be a threat anymore. Well, it's almost impossible to do that because the training courses, the anti-aggression courses, the anger management courses, are available, but in a limited volume. So the men really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And eventually the European courts said, no, this is against human rights, you must stop this. And in 2012, the sentence was made illegal. So we no longer have people being sentenced. But as we sit here recording this today, there are something like 3,000 people in prison that are way over tariff, as they call it. So only last night I was talking to a gentleman who has served, I think, about 15 years in prison for an offence that would normally carry about 4 years. But he is still an IPP prisoner. He hasn't been released from it. And he's no threat to anybody nowadays. He's learned his lesson. He's just, if he came in here today and you sat chatting to him and you didn't know what he'd done, you would just think he's another bloke.
When you say you were chatting to him last night then, so you just having a phone call?
Yeah, phone call.
So you can phone up onto the wings in the prison?
No, he's not in prison anymore.
He's out now?
He's released on licence, so he's on probation. And he's terrified that he'll do anything wrong and probation will simply send him back. He's no longer allowed access to his family, so his loneliness is terrible. So yeah, we chat on the phone regularly.
So it's back to that, supporting people who are lonely again.
And I've done this with a number of people, and my wife will always say, don't bring them to our house, John. And I collaborate with an old timer, Ed Flanagan, and I can remember when I first started dealing with Ed, my wife said exactly that. What's he done, John? I said, I don't know, but I said, he's not any threat really. Well, don't ever bring him here. So one day we were working in Hewell prison last year with another lady who's an author. And after it was all over, I said, will you come back home for a cup of tea? And they said, yes. So I walked in the room with a lady and Ed. My wife was sort of, who have we got here? But anyway, once we'd sat in the garden, had a cup of tea, my wife, Diane, had joined us, and they'd all gone home. She said, he's all right really, isn't he? Well, he's harmless now. He lives in sheltered accommodation and he rides a mobility scooter. He's not going to rob you anymore. But 20 years ago, he might have.
Those scooters are pretty quick though, aren't they? I mean, if you've got something you want to get away, that's the thing to get away on.
So you do meet people, and in conversation, their crimes come out.
So, John, thanks for sharing these stories. It's really interesting. So, you just mentioned about, as you get to know some of the people that you meet in prison, that sometimes, like you say there, but for the grace of God go I. Have you any more stories like that then, where you've met people and things have just happened and it's been, I don't know, sad maybe really to understand what's happened? Or
yes, the stories are endless really, because I've been doing it for some while. I've met so many people. And they're really interesting stories. But I suppose life deals you a lemon sometimes, doesn't it? And things happen in your life that you don't want to happen, but they happen anyway. An old guy I met again in Hewell. I've done a lot of work in Hewell prison. An old guy there was on the point of being let out, and he was absolutely terrified of being released. And so, as I always do, when I see somebody in some state of stress, I always just sit down and have a chat with him like we are today, really. I said, what's your problem? He said, well, I'm coming to the end of a 32-year sentence.
Gosh.
Oh, said I, 32 years. My brain immediately thought, well, I wonder what he did. And the story is thus. He had been convicted of attempted murder, not murder, attempted. And I said to him, so you weren't any good at that either then? And he just laughed, as you've laughed. I said, had you been any good at it, you'd have killed him, wouldn't you? He said, yes. So that was the first part of the conversation. That's a way of breaking down the barriers. That's the way of me saying to him, I'm your friend, really. Let's have a chat. So he'd been sentenced to life for attempted murder, and he'd served, I think, about 15, 16 years of it. And then he'd been released. But what many people don't understand is when you get a life sentence, it means your life. It means the whole of your life. It means that when you're released at the end of your prison sentence, you are still under the control of the police. So if you commit any crime whatsoever after that, they'll put you back inside.
Right.
So you've only got to do a bit of shoplifting and you can go back in. And actually, if truth were spoken, many people will do this. Many people that are reduced to living on the streets, homeless, got no real foundation in their life, will commit a very minor crime in the winter months to get inside. Because inside is warm, inside has got food, and inside they know their way around. It's their familiarity.
It's quite safe and secure for them, isn't it?
He'd been released and he'd stayed out for some years. And then he'd done something, I don't know what, and they'd put him away. And he'd been in jail for a number of years, but was about to be released. Now, what is it we're releasing these people to? So if you think to yourself, first of all, what's the technology level 32 years ago? What has he got available? Has he got a bank account? No. So how's he going to get some money then? How's he going to get his pension paid or benefits or anything like that? He's got to leave prison, which will give him about £80 as he departs. Where's he going to live? Well, theoretically, he'll live in approved premises that the probation service provide, but not always. And in more extreme cases, they're released with a tent and a sleeping bag. And that's not right either, because society doesn't have all the facilities to deal with the number of people that we have in the system. What about if he's released early? Now, currently, the government are saying the way we're going to lower some of the numbers in prison is to let people out 30 days early. Well, that's fine, but the 3 months or so before they're released, they put together a release plan based on a certain date. So if you let them out 30 days earlier, the plan's not going to start for 30 days. So where are they going to be for that 30 days? Some, of course, will have family that will take them in. Many won't. Many will have committed a crime within the family, particularly sex offenders, and the family have just said, you're not coming back here. So it's a very sad situation, and it's a vote winner. That's the way the government will look at it. They'll think, oh, the government are doing something about it. They're building new prisons and not telling people that as fast as they're building new ones, they're closing old ones down. So the actual capacity of the prison system, well, we're currently at about 80,000 people in prison tonight, costing you and me a lot of money. The capacity, I think, is about 98%, something like that. Don't hold me to the figures, they might not be accurate, but suffice to say they're nearly full.
So your work in the prisons then, if we come back round to your social enterprise, so at the moment you've found that there's more and more people are lonely and they're wanting to talk and they're wanting to come and join your groups, and it's really good for their mental health. So where's your social enterprise at the moment, and how are you finding it as an individual, pushing this and promoting it and looking for revenue so that you can do more and more? Where's it at and how are you finding it?
It's at the moment living on the fat of the land, because I've not had any prison work this year. So I had a long contract last year in Hull that came to an end. That was fully funded by the prison. Obviously that funded my time in the prison. It funded all the expenses I go to deliver. So we supply books and writing materials and pencils and visual aids. I personally didn't deliver the whole year because I went on holiday. So I had to pay somebody to come in and cover. I had to pay that someone to come in and train in the first place. So by the end of the year, there was a pot of money in the bank that was available for progressive. And that's what we've been doing ever since. Treading water, really, looking for more work. And that's one of the problems of a social enterprise, that it runs on very low overheads and very low numbers. We have had in the past funding from the National Lottery. We've had funding from the Postcode Lottery. I had funding initially from the School for Social Enterprise. But funding is being chased by so many people like me nowadays. It's very difficult to get funding. And of course, as time goes on, the money available to the prison for funding it themselves is also limited. So we walk a tightrope. And so at the moment, what am I doing? I'm providing free services to local care homes and so on. Just go in and tell a story and make their day and fulfil my social enterprise requirement. But I'm doing it based on the money that was left over from last year.
And the talks you're doing at the moment, when you go in, are you predominantly finding people like the talks about the famous people?
Yeah.
Or do they like the poetry, or is it a bit of a combination?
No, mainly in care homes, it's they like the talk. So again, you could go in the same care home every week and give the same talk if all the people had dementia. But they don't all have dementia. So it becomes a bit of a... I don't know whether we still have Derby and Joan clubs, but it becomes a bit of a social event, if you like. That the care home itself will pay for perhaps a singer to come in and sing for a couple of hours. They might have somebody come in and engage in a quiz. They might teach a bit of line dancing, might do some chair exercises, whatever. And it's to keep the older folk that are living there mentally and physically up to speed as much as they can be, taking into account their general health.
Have you got any thoughts or ideas for our listeners and viewers around social enterprises?
Yes, certainly. So I was motivated by a friend, as we said, Andy Mullaney, who suggested I'd be good, and it all developed from there. So number one on your journey, if you would like to follow me and form a social enterprise, and its age is entirely irrelevant, is number one, what would be your cause? What would you seek to do? Do you perhaps have an autistic child and you'd like to meet other autistic parents or parents of autistic children and do something about their autism? Maybe you've got children that won't go to school, so you're homeschooling them. Maybe you've got teenagers that are going down the wrong road. I wrote a book called Choices and Chances. And it was in coalition with Ed Flanagan, my collaborator. He made all the wrong choices, got in with the wrong people, and followed a life of criminality. I didn't. I luckily, easily could have done the opposite, but luckily made the right choices. And the book, which is only a small book, and it's freely available, details how you can go about making the right choices. And so it is with social enterprises. You need to have a purpose, you need to have something. I have a friend, for example, this is a very good highlight of what a social enterprise is about. So a lady I met on the social enterprise course in 2016 was a mum had a son called Ben, and she was pregnant with twins, Oscar and Noah. Noah, unfortunately, after 24 hours, died. Oscar, the following day, had a stroke, which has left him with cerebral palsy. He's now, 8 years of age. And the problem she had was, obviously, they were in intensive care. Her surviving son was in intensive care for about 8 weeks. Ben, of course, who was 10 years of age, he knew very well that mum was pregnant and mum was having babies. And so therefore she had that cross to bear. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that although she gave birth to twins, only one's coming home, and he's not coming home yet because we've got to spend all our days at the hospital? So Nanny looked after Ben, and it was a very, very difficult, traumatic experience. So when it was all over and she got her act together, she formed a social enterprise which is called Noah's Star, and I would encourage anybody to look up this social enterprise. And she has amassed around her about 50 volunteers who, within the hospital, Birmingham Women's Hospital, if you as a parent turn up in the same situation as she was, i.e. you've got a baby in there, you're there spending all day there, perhaps dad has to go to work, perhaps there's children at home that need looking after, that's fine, bring your other children in and we'll run a creche. For as long as you want to be there, we'll look after your child.
That's excellent, isn't it?
It's a fantastic charity. And
Noah's Star.
Noah's Star, yes, look up. Joanne Shellham is a personal friend.
Yeah.
And how do I help her? How does my social enterprise help that social enterprise? Well, it's simple. I go in dressed as Santa. So every Christmas, we started with the first one. Every Christmas I go in dressed as Santa, and all the mums want is a picture of the baby with Santa. So I'm confronted by teeny tiny babies that in many cases weigh less than a kilo when they're born, are very premature and are very sick babies. And I get them on my arm, tubes and God knows what around, and the mum gets the picture. And the first year I did it, the very last child I went to was Sebastian. And all mum wanted was a picture of Santa with Seb. She called him Seb. So he was in a little plastic cot, see-through cot, with tubes and wires and everything going all over the place. And so she got her picture. And when she finished, I said to her, do you have a camera with you, a movie camera? She said, well, it's on the phone. I said, would you like me to do a message to Seb that you can play him when he gets older? Now, what am I doing now? I'm providing hope, aren't I? I don't know he's going to survive any more than she does. It doesn't look as if he's going to. But she got the camera out and I started talking to Seb and explaining to Seb that although this was his first Christmas, it wasn't going to be his last, and that he would be going home shortly, and next Christmas Santa will bring him some presents and all will be well. And by the time I'd finished, not only were the parents in tears, but I was as well. It was the most wonderful bit of video that I think I've ever done. And I've done many of them since, and they're never easy. So the following Christmas, we did it again, and we did it during COVID over Zoom. And Seb hasn't been there every year because quite often he's not well. But he's getting big now, and he's survived.
What a story! That's great.
Yeah, and in telling you this story this morning, it pretty much brings a lump to my throat even now.
Yeah.
Because it's the little things you do. So when you're, I just this week signed up to do some stand-up comedy to raise money for a charity that's very close to my heart, called Effie's Bubbles. And again, your listeners, viewers can look up Effie's Bubbles. So Effie was a little girl whose mum knew that she wasn't very well, and she was 3.5, and mum kept taking her to the doctors, and the doctor kept saying, oh, it's constipation, or it's this, or it's that. He didn't really know. And eventually one Sunday morning, Eilish, the mum, woke up and thought, I'm having no more of this. I'm taking Effie to Great Ormond Street Hospital. They live in London, and see what they say. So off they go to the hospital. And the hospital didn't know either, but they admitted her and said, we'll look into it, we'll test her and find out. And that was on the Sunday afternoon, and on the Thursday morning, Effie died, aged 3.5. And she died from a thing called germ cell cancer. Now, germ cell cancer is not easily diagnosed. If it were diagnosed, it can easily be cured. Much like leukemia in young children, it can be treated, but you need the doctors to understand what they're seeing in the surgery. And so Eilish, who's subsequently had another baby, another 2 babies since, started a charity for Effie's memory. And it's called Effie's Bubbles because Effie loved her Shetland pony and the pony was called Bubbles.
Okay.
So Grandad Pat, who I know, who is Ed Flanagan's brother, which is how I learnt the story, we're now going to do some stand-up comedy in Birmingham in June, where I'll make a fool of myself, but it will raise a lot of money for Effie's Bubbles. And anybody that wants to give can just go to Just Giving. Not yet, because I haven't set the page up. But by the time this goes out, there will be a page. And it will feature me at the Ultra Comedy event, which is kicking off at Rosie's on Broad Street on June the 23rd. So
brilliant, thank you. Well, just to wrap things up, John, one question I'd like to ask, which I should have asked right at the beginning. What's the name of your social enterprise?
My social enterprise is called Tutis Online. C.I.C.
Online.
So and I wish I hadn't called it that. But it goes back a very long way in history, which I won't bore you with, because I once had a company called Tutis.
Right.
It's a Latin word, and it means secure, safe, protect, and I suppose that's what we do.
Yeah, well, I think that's an absolute perfect place for us to wrap up, and thank you so much for sharing what you do and your social enterprise and the messages for everyone. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and keep on, and I look forward to hearing how the comedy show goes in June.
Let me say thank you to you, Richard. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. So we've come to the end of our podcast, and we've got something for you. If you're interested in starting or considering starting your own side hustle startup, then head over to our platform at rocketeer.ac, where you can get started with the Startup Challenge.